The 52nd World Communications Day was held in 2018. Again, this is during Pope Francis's time. This is a long presentation, so hang on, hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. Okay, here we go. Communication is part of God's plan for us. It's funny to me how Pope Francis said things, and again, when I write them, I might paraphrase them a little bit. Sometimes they're direct quotes, sometimes I'm paraphrasing, but please access the actual text or watch the video where I stumble through reading it with my squeaky freezer in the background. But he says things, and I'm like, okay, well, yeah, of course. Of course communication is part of God's plan for us, but is that something I think about on a regular basis? No. But we communicate. We were given bodies and minds and hearts and souls and mouths and a voice and the inclination to develop language and communicate with one another. And yeah, so that kind of elevates this idea of communication in my mind, that this is a part of God's plan. The way we communicate is all a part of this creation, this story. Everything on earth is about a story, and I don't think that's ever going to stop. And communication is a large part of stories. Stories have action, and they have sometimes narrated thoughts, or you can see people thinking, and then there are times when people talk to themselves and they talk to each other. So yes, of course, communication is a part of God's plan. We can communicate like God intended. Since we are made in the image of God, we can communicate as God intended us to. Or, I'm thinking there's probably an or here, we can yield to our pride and selfishness and distort communication. So we can either communicate the way God intended for us to when He created us, with the intention, I suppose, of us staying in the Garden of Eden and having everything we needed. Or we can, because we have free will, communicate in the way our little tiny selves, our little egos do, through pride and selfishness. And when those are our intentions, to speak like our ego instead of like God wanted us to, then we distort communication because we have to, right? Usually. If we're telling the truth, that's what God intended. And if our intention is something else, then it's going to end up being distorted communication or distorted truth. Pope Francis mentions Cain and Abel, Tower of Babel, these Genesis stories. So this idea that of fake news, which is what this particular message is about, is not new, right? It's been since the beginning of time. People have lied. The serpent lied, and then we get people who can't get along and are struck down. I need to study both of those stories a little bit more to kind of grasp what he's talking about here, but twisted truth are a symptom of our condition as humans. And it's been here since the beginning of time. God's plan was for effective expression, a responsible search for truth and goodness. God created us with the ability to communicate with an intention, Pope Francis is saying, for us to express ourselves effectively and responsibly by searching for truth and goodness. And that makes sense to me. What do we do instead? Fake news, that's what we do. Fake news is false information. Non-existent or distorted data. He's defining it. This thing that humans do instead of telling the truth is wrong, right? It's either data that's completely wrong or, completely manufactured, or it's distorted in some way. It is meant to deceive and manipulate the reader. That's the whole point. And I mentioned in another episode of this that David Ogilvy, one of the fathers of advertising, who I didn't know him, he might not have even been a nice guy, I have no idea. But he said that if you have a good product, all you have to do is inform people. So I keep coming back to that because I teach PR and advertising, so I keep coming back to the thought that when you can't or don't want to just inform people, and you want to lie, manipulate, and deceive and all of that, your audience, your reader, your audience, then it's because your product's not good, or at the very least isn't real. The idea that you're selling, the product that you're selling, the service that you're selling, the movement that you're selling, the political party or person, the entertainer, whatever it is, if you're having to deceive, it means your product's not very good. It advances specific goals, which could be influence in political realms or economic realms. Well, what does that mean? Well, you want power and money, yeah? So if you're distorting the truth to advance your goals in politics and in economics, then it's probably because you want power and money. And again, your product is not very good, or you'd be telling the truth. The product is not what the audience wants, or you'd be telling the truth. Fake news mimics real news to be seen as plausible. I think I'm missing a word there, but yeah. He talks about that within the Garden of Eden, and the serpent kind of told a half-truth about God said you couldn't eat any of the trees, and she's like, no, God said I couldn't eat from this tree. And he's like, oh, so it's this mimicking reality. I think, unfortunately, very wounded people wound others, and sometimes those very wounded people are so cut off from themselves that they can't really even relate to other people in a normal way, and they've learned to mimic the things. Empathy. They've learned to mimic those things, even though they don't really understand them and don't feel them. And maybe they've learned to see the door handle on other people that are on the outside based on their wounds that they have had when they were young, and they use those against people, So it's this whole, it's sort of real, it's not real, but it's close enough to being real that it seems plausible, because we have to wonder how we're so we're so easily manipulated. Well, we've talked before about we have these autonomous complexes, these triggers that people can push. I remember the first time I heard that word. It's not that it hadn't happened to me. It was that I didn't know what it was. And I heard a man say that, well, it's the triggers. You get triggered. And it's so true, So for some people, it's getting cash in their hand triggers some sort of behavior, whatever it is. Maybe it's buying pizza. Maybe it's buying drugs. But it's a trigger. And what he's saying here is that with fake news, it triggers us because it seems real, it seems plausible, it's enough of the truth that we kind of believe it because we want to. It fits into our worldview, for one thing. It captures attention by appealing to stereotypes and prejudices. We talked, I think, last time about the word prejudice means to prejudge somebody. Stereotypes are a method of that prejudging. You see a mother in a minivan with 3 kids, we stereotype that person as a soccer mom, and we believe there are certain behaviors or purchasing decisions that come with that stereotype. And the list goes on and on. And so fake news uses, I think as humans, we want to feel safe. We want to feel like we understand the things and the people that are around us. And I think that's why, I'm the world's worst at wanting to put a astrological label or an Enneagram label on somebody's head, or strengths or whatever, so that I can understand them. I can understand myself. But everybody's different. Everybody's unique. Everybody has a different fingerprint, DNA. And you can't. Sure, we have tendencies, but every individual is completely individual. And just because I like to wear my hair a certain way doesn't mean I'm going to purchase a certain product. It doesn't necessarily mean any of that. And that might not have been a good example, but exploits emotions, anxiety, anger, frustration. I think especially people who have a hard time feeling like to make other people feel things for them. They're just as happy, with you saying yes to whatever they're doing or getting upset. They're just as happy either way for whatever reason. They exploit our emotions. They exploit whatever we might be anxious about. Maybe we're anxious about maybe mother. I meant to say money, but maybe mother. Maybe money. Maybe we're anxious about the weather, or we're anxious about the future, or whatever it is. Maybe we are frustrated and easily angered on certain topics. They've found those trigger buttons and they've pushed them. With social media, untrue stories spread quickly. In fact, they spread more quickly than the truth. And that's one of the reasons that social media institutions, companies, they actually benefit if they're selling ads. They actually benefit from the spread of untruth, because it does spread so quickly, and we click and we click and we click and we share and we comment and we like and we do all those things that they need for us to do so that they can sell more advertising. Yeah, we are the product, right? If it's free, currently platforms like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are free to use. And if a product is free, then that means we are the product. They're making money off of us. They're selling advertisements and they're making money off of us. It's kind of funny. The lies spread quicker because they have punched one of our emotions. It's hard to contain or fix the damage. Pope Francis says, even when people in authority come on and say, that is not true, that's really difficult to fix the damage. And this was in 2018. And he gave a lot of credit back then to what that platforms were trying to stop the spread of fake news. As we know now, like today is in 2025, platforms are no longer trying to stop the spread of fake news. So that has changed. It's hard to fix the damage. It's hard to contain it. In fact, once people believe it, they're probably not going to unbelieve it. That is the way with propaganda and brainwashing. Disinformation thrives because people are only consuming extreme sources. Yes, we talked about being behind these barricades, barricading ourselves behind these extreme sources. And so, of course, disinformation thrives. It thrives not only because I think the audience believes it, I think the people sharing the disinformation oftentimes believe it. I know that that's not always the case. I think sometimes people who share disinformation know that it's not true, and they share it anyway because it serves their agenda. But I think there are some people who get as swept up in The propaganda as the propagandists get as swept up in the propaganda as the audience does. And they start believing their own lies. Even maybe in the beginning, they knew they were lying. Now it's gotten so twisted, they believe their own lies. I've seen that happen in personal relationships, that people who it takes 10 lies to cover up one lie. And then by the time they've done this over and over again, they really start to believe it. I've seen it. Absence of healthy confrontation of other sources. In fact, we can't handle it, can we? We just can't handle it. I think there probably was a time when things weren't so extreme, and we could come closer to the middle where the truth probably sits, and we could have a constructive conversation. We might not agree, but we could put it all on the table and we could sort through it and say, well, okay, maybe this works, but this doesn't. And maybe you're right about this, and maybe I'm right about this, and we can solve these problems. We're not there anymore. We can't handle confrontation because it's so extreme. There's no common ground in these two extreme things. It's dichotomous. That's not where the transcendent third lies, by the way. And so this absence of this type of healthy confrontation of other sources, meaning hopefully the unbiased true sources that really large groups of people are not focused on, causes it to be unhealthy, which could challenge these constructive conversations, could challenge these prejudices, according to Pope Francis, could generate constructive dialogue. Constructive meaning building bridges, building upon things, building good things out of truth. And instead of challenging our prejudices are getting reinforced, right? Through our conditioning. Disinformation turns people into unwilling accomplices, spreading biased and baseless ideas. And I think what he means here with the unwilling accomplice is that we don't even know we're doing it. We're not necessarily, the people that are spreading this disinformation think it's true. So they're unwillingly spreading the disinformation because they don't understand that it's lies. Spreading these biased stuff, this false information. He says, if it discredits others, presenting them as enemies, demonizing them, promoting conflict, then it's not true. He said it's not true in the fact that that's not what God intended with our communication. God did not intend us to demonize others with our communication. God did not intend us to create conflict. End result of untruth, the spread of arrogance and hatred. He said that's the only thing that can happen. That good things never happen from the spread of untruth. Okay, we could probably pull some idea out of our head based on some crime drama we saw where telling a lie helped save somebody's life. Okay, I get that. But what he's saying is this constant spread of lies online or even face-to-face is never going to end good. It's not going to end well. And he's suggesting that it just spreads arrogance and hatred. We all must counter these falsehoods, which is not an easy task. Whew. It is not. And I don't know that you're ever going to change anybody's mind. And I'm not even positive it's worth the effort to try. But he has mentioned time and time again in these messages that he'd rather see a bruised church in the streets than an arrogant one in the pews. Not that all people that are in a pew are arrogant, but he's saying have courage to go into the streets, even if those are the digital highway, because there's people getting beaten and abandoned every day on these streets, and we need to be there to help them. We need to be there to give an alternative. And so what I think he's meaning here by counter is not fight with. It's counter as in a counter culture. It's giving an alternative view, giving the God view, giving the Jesus good news of the gospel view, giving the loving view, giving the peaceful creation view of the truth as God intended us. But again, it is not an easy task. Often use sophisticated psychological mechanisms. I was really glad to hear him say this in this particular message. I read it. Yes, and this is what I mean. What they call them psychops, psychological operations that are used in the spycraft and intelligence forces. It's a war game. And they're being used on us. Eddie Bernays, one of the fathers of public relations, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he used psychology to advance during the war, to advance the buy-in for us to be in the war, both World War I and World War II, I think. And through propaganda, through films, through leaflets or whatever were being dropped, and propaganda films in front of movies that people were watching. And he said, oh, if propaganda works in wartime, I bet it works in peacetime too. And so they're using these psychological mechanisms against us, or to sell products and services or ideas or whatever. Now, I'm not saying we're not in a war. I think we're in a war sometimes, based on the intentions, the selfish intentions of people. But we do need to understand how our unconscious works, how people can use it against us. And healing our wounds, which is another not easy task to do, healing our wounds makes us less triggerable. And some people do this through going to therapy. Some people do it through journaling. Some people can watch a movie that resonates with them and cry about something painful that happened to them, or read a book or whatever. That's catharsis. Aristotle taught us about catharsis way, before the time of Christ. And so this is not new stuff. But the only way to keep from having these mechanisms used against us is to heal our wounds. Unmask the snake tactics used by those who disguise and strike anytime, in any place. So yeah, we need to learn these things. I don't think we teach our young people, we don't teach ourselves, and we need to. I think some people just instinctively know, based on maybe how life was when they were growing up. They instinctively know how to do this snake tactic thing. And then some of the rest of us don't, so I don't think we get taught to do it. And those who do it don't want us to know about it. Never going to reveal it, Very rarely does that happen, where someone who's using snake tactics all of a sudden decide not to. And teach the world, but we need to learn these things, and we do need to teach it. The crafty serpent in Genesis was the first fake news, the beginning of evil. And I think that's how we know we have free will. We hear God's voice. Even in the Garden of Eden, we hear God's voice and we hear the serpent's voice. We hear both voices. We have the free will to choose. Which one? Are we going to choose the truth or the fake news? Are we going to know which is true and which is fake? The father of lies, this serpent was called. Worms its way into the heart with false and alluring arguments. Well, we're going to know that it's fake news because our vices are being used against us. Do you want to be, our greed, our jealousies, our lust for power, all of these things, our vices can be very alluring until we've experienced them enough to know that they don't work, they don't make us happy. Then we have a realization and an aha moment that it's God's will that's healthy. It is being kind and helping others and love and peace. And that's the stuff we really want. But we have to do a certain amount of healing before we get to that point. The tempter pretends to be Eve's friend, pretends to be concerned for her welfare, begins by saying a partial truth. We've talked a little bit about this already, but the pretending. And sometimes we want to believe it. We want to believe it, even though we've seen a lot of red flags and we're pretty sure this is a tempter and that they're really not looking out for us, but we want to believe they are, so we keep going with it. There is no such thing as harmless disinformation, Pope Francis says, and I would agree. Again, we could probably come up with some scenario, but by and large, there is no such thing as harmless disinformation. And, selfish agendas don't care about anybody else. Narcissistic agendas do not care. They don't care if other people are harmed physically or mentally or financially or emotionally. They don't care. I think they don't have the capacity to care because of the wounds that they've had. I've been thinking a lot about this idea that every knee shall bow. Eventually, I think Richard Ward talks about this, eventually, everyone will come to Jesus, Eventually, it's the spiral upwards. He says the 2-step back, 3-step forward, 2-step back, but eventually, even in that dance, you eventually get there. But until then, we just have to deal with people that are on different levels of consciousness. And if you can see it as that, if you can see how they are doing harm based on their uncontrollable complexes that were developed through the wounds in their childhood, they have no control over their selfishness. They have no control over their narcissism. And therefore, what good does it do for me to get angry about it? I should see them and with compassion and say, oh, you can't control this, but I'm going to try really hard to heal my wounds so that I can control what I do or don't do. You can't currently control your actions. I'm going to try to heal so I can control my reactions. But until then, there is no such thing as harmless disinformation. Fake news appeals to humans' insatiable greed. Again, if you've healed, then maybe you don't have insatiable greed, and I hope we all heal and don't. But many do. And they think, well, if I get this, then I'll feel better. And if I get this, I'll feel better. And if I get this, I'll feel better. But what I've learned, the more money you make, the more money it takes, to live, because you've created a life that's just expensive, and it doesn't satisfy you. And St. Augustine said we only rest in God, which Pope Leo talks about a lot now. Disinformation is fed by manipulative economic aims rooted in thirst for power, desire to possess and enjoy. Hedonism. Definitely there are people who have a thirst for power. There are many people who don't want power at all. There are those who want to possess and control, and then there are those who want hedonistic desires. And again, none of those things are ever going to fulfill you or make you happy. victims of deceptive power, the deceptive power of evil, from lie to rob us of interior freedom. We think, I guess, a lot about our exterior freedom or lack thereof. We don't think a lot about our interior freedom. And if your mind is being controlled by somebody else, or your emotions are being controlled by somebody else, you don't have freedom. And the other person who's controlling you with these mechanisms will not respect you because they know what's going on. You may not know what's going on, but they do. So you're never going to gain somebody's respect by being so much a puppet, right? You only get their respect by cutting those puppet strings and getting back control of your own life and gaining back your interior freedom. Education for truth means learning to discern, evaluate, and understand our deepest desires. Many of us don't sit around thinking about our deepest desires, but we should. In fact, when I get off of here, I think I'm going to sit down and think about it. What is it that I desire? Are those desires selfish? Are those desires from God? Are those desires from the father of lies? I don't know. We need to evaluate these things. I think we just live like bumper cars. We get hit and we fall back, and then we go hit and we, somebody else falls back. It's just a bunch of back and forth, like tug of war. And we don't put a lot of thought. We're not contemplative. I've been recently, thanks to watching a Richard Rohr video, I decided to do 20 minutes of contemplation every day. I've never been a good meditator. What I have found, I take my iPad and I set the timer for 20 minutes and I just try to sit there and not think. It doesn't work, but what I'm finding is that I feel hungry for it. And I am sad when it's over. And yes, I could do it an hour, or I could do it 20 minutes twice a day or 3 times a day or whatever, and maybe I'll grow to that. But I am hungry for this time where I'm just sitting there and doing nothing and trying not to think, because all the rest of my day is filled with thoughts and worries and anxieties and scrolling and doom scrolling and all these things. Answering emails, answering text messages, screens. And even though I'm sitting there watching the timer go down on my iPad, it's just different. And it is that kind of contemplation where we tap into God in the now, in the eternal now, and we feel what that calm, restful peace feels like, and we want more of it. And it's only until we can have that level of discernment that we'll be able to spot the truth or sense the truth. The truth will set you free. Lies contaminate and darken our interior life. Our own lies that we tell darken our interior life. The lies that other people tell us darken our interior life. Because I think a part of us always knows the truth. And if you're just going along with somebody to maintain a relationship and keep the peace, that's soul sucking. So, yeah, I think, this statement from the Bible, the truth will set you free, has to be true, doesn't it? I think we don't want to be free. I don't know why, but we don't. We don't want freedom. We want some kind of unhealthy codependent relationship. Because that's what we were conditioned to think was love when it wasn't, And so the idea of freedom scares us. Therefore, truth scares us. So he quotes Dostoevsky. People start believing their own lies and others' lies, and they lose respect for themselves and others. We talked about this already. But it is true. And I think it's like learning, like rote learning. You hear something over and over and over and over and over again. Eventually, you're going to learn it, whether it's true or false. You're telling this lie over and over and over again, and there's a part of you that's brainwashing yourself, and you believe that it's true when it's not. He also said, having no respect, then, these people cease to love. They give way to their vices, all from continual lying. Just lies creates a lack of love, a lack of respect. And this road to the vices, just through lying. And you know that vices usually have to do with addictions. And if we're in the middle of our addictions, we are not free. We're not able to not choose that piece of cake. We're unable to not choose that cigarette or whatever it is. You're in your vices. You're unable not to lie. You are unable not to harm others. You've all created through continual lying. I think we're living in a culture right now where people know that other people are lying and they don't care because they want what they think that other person's going to give them. And that is not going to end well. That's going to lead a culture of no love, no respect, and a culture of a whole lot of people living in their vices. And I think we're going to be really shocked. I hope not, but we might be. What is the antidote to falsehood? Purification by the truth. I am the truth, Jesus says. The antidote for these falsehoods, the antidote to not falling into this pattern of lying and that lead to vices, is purification by truth. And Jesus says he is the truth. And so the antidote to these falsehoods is Jesus. Discern the truth, and the God truth, according to Pope Francis, encourages communion, promotes goodness. And you could be really angry, you might live with a person who lies all the time, and you might get really angry at this person. You have to ask yourself why you live with a person who lies all the time. And maybe you do because you have no other choice and you're trapped. But I've lost my thought. But you're living with somebody who lies all the time, then you feel justified in screaming at them or telling them they're horrible and blaming it all on them, But that voice is probably also the father of lies voice in your head. The truth which comes from God, encourages communion. And sometimes you have to have boundaries, and it's impossible to have communion with people who aren't going to tell you the truth. But God's communication is always going to promote goodness and encourage communication. It discerns, we discern falsehoods. We can tell that it's false if it isolates, divides, and opposes. And so, this is brilliant, right? That truth is not, Pope Francis is saying that truth is not just about knowing the facts. He's talking about truth in the highest sense of the word. You'll know the truth when it encourages communion and promotes goodness. You'll know that it's not truth if it isolates, divides, and opposes. And how many of us all day long are saying things that are dividing us or that oppose others? None of us we're all guilty of this. An argument can use undeniable facts, but if it hurts or discredits another, it is not truthful in the capital T word of God. I might be a great debater and I may win the argument. But if I hurt and discredit the person I'm talking to, then it's not truthful. Might be a winning argument, but it's not truthful from the position of God. Recognize the truth of statements by their fruits. Do they provoke quarrels? Do they promote division? Do they encourage resignation? Do they cause people to give up? That's not truth from the God sense. Or do they promote informed and mature reflection? I think that's supposed to say reflection. Lead to constructive and fruitful dialogue? Then that is truth. That's the truth of God. The best antidote to falsehoods are not strategies, but people. Yeah, I teach strategic communication. And what he's saying is that I can plan all day long, but it's not going to be the strategies that are antidotes to falsehood. It's going to be people. It's going to be seeing the people. It's going to be telling the stories of people, regular people, people who are not greedy, people who are ready to listen, people who engage in sincere dialogue, attracted by goodness, people who take responsibility for their language. Those are the people that we have to focus on instead of our strategies if we want to have an antidote to falsehood. It's a weighty responsibility which rests on the shoulders of journalists who Pope Francis called the protectors of news. I think that the things that often get attacked are things that lead to goodness, right? So we have all of these things in communication that are tools for good, whether that's journalism or education, or whatever. And those things get attacked. They can be used for good or for evil. And I think that those who are selfish and narcissistic and greedy and lust for power and whatever, they want to squish all the things that are going to be the antidotes of that. And so they learn to use it. They used it against us. Journalism was meant to be what they call the fourth estate. The press is the only institution mentioned in the Constitution, right? It's the First Amendment talks about the freedom of the press. And so it's important that fourth estate is supposed to protect us from corruption. And it's not new. It's been such a powerful tool. It's always been used for good or for evil through the ages, ever since it existed. But it can be a very powerful tool to helping maintain democracy, among other things. And so Pope Francis is saying journalists are meant to be protectors of the news, protectors of this truth. And I'm very pro journalism. I feel like we need to promote the journalism that is not the extreme versions, but the unbiased, reliable, valid. And it's sometimes hard to find, but certainly not impossible to find. And there are media bias charts out there that you can look at and see which ones are in the middle up top. Those are the ones we need to listen to. It's not just a job, it's a mission. People die covering stories all over the world. It is... Aaron Sorkin wrote The Newsroom, and you may or may not like it, but I watch that show and it makes me cry. I probably need to watch it right now so that I can cry. It's a mission. And yes, it can be money making, and it was never meant to be, but when it's not, it is a mission and can be a mission for God. Informing others means forming others. I thought that was interesting. That was one of those powerful statements to me. When I'm giving information, even here, there's a formation happening. And I need to take that really seriously. And he's suggesting that journalists take that really seriously. And if you are using lies to form people in a way that's self-serving to you, I think God's not going to be happy about that. Now, God is merciful and gives lots of chances, but informing others means forming others. You may be helping change them for good or for bad. Ensuring accuracy promotes goodness, generates trust, and opens the way to peace. Accuracy in your facts, accuracy in your stories, goodness, truth, trust, and peace. Goodness, trust, and peace through truth, right? I don't know. I wonder about that. You know you can't trust people who lie to you. And it makes you wonder why people are trusting people who are lying to them. And the only thing I can think of is that it's kind of a wink wink, we have the same agenda, and I know you're lying to those people, but I know it's a lie. Wink wink. Co-conspirators of the misinformation. That's the only thing I can think of. A journalism by people, for people, at the service of all, but especially for those who have no voice. There are people all over the world, including people here in the United States of America, who have no voice at all, for whatever reason. And journalists go out and risk their lives to tell the stories of those people. And Pope Francis, being the shepherd he was, believed that all people were created in the image of God, and that all people were equal, and that all people needed to be cared for. But there are lots of people who don't feel that way because of their prejudices and their stereotypes. And every knee shall bow eventually. But until then, this is just a battle that sometimes feels it can't be won, but the more journalists, the more citizen journalists that we have out there, by the people, for the service of all, especially with those with no voices, that's our hope, and hope never disappoints. A journalism less about breaking news, more about exploring the causes of conflict and finding resolutions. There are magazines and newspapers out there that call themselves solution journalism. That's what we teach where I work. And I think absolutely, are we going to be able to solve all problems? No, but if we don't try, we never will. And the only way to solve a problem is to find out the root of it, to say what is causing this, and then to look for solutions. There are countries all over the world that have all the solutions we're looking for, but we're not looking for them. If we were looking for them, they're there. We could find them and use them, but we're not. And so we don't. And our problems never solve. They just get worse. But Pope Francis is suggesting that instead of just being about breaking news, getting 1 million clicks or whatever, that we need to find the causes of conflicts and find resolutions. Well, how are journalists going to be able to afford to do that? Most of us, I pay for my journalism right now. I'm able to do that. Maybe you do too, but there are many people who don't. They want it to be free. And if it's going to be free, then it has to be based on advertising dollars or the federal government or donations. And we know that currently the federal government's pulling funding for public broadcasting. And so if journalism is getting paid through advertising, then the advertisers sort of control everything. And then now we have really large companies that own all kinds of journalism media. They own broadcast media corporation, really, really large, online and offline, traditional and non-traditional. And then these really large entities then control the stories that are told and the people that are hired and the what we get as audiences. So the only way to have this thing that Pope Francis says we need is for us to pay for it, us to be willing to pay for it, whether that's through donations or subscriptions or whatever. That is the only way. Maybe journalists need to be like artists and have patrons who support their art. And I think that happens sometimes when people are willing to give money online or through social media to keep somebody who's doing good work going as an independent journalist. We're seeing more and more independent journalists pop up, and they are breaking stories. And but we need maybe to not just focus so much on the breaking news, as Pope Francis says, but on the problem solving. A journalism points to alternatives to verbal violence. When we're being verbally violent, we're creating problems and maintaining problems. And so journalism, a solutions-based journalism, is going to point to alternatives to that. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Pope Francis uses the prayer of St. Francis and changes the words to, it's very good and you should read it. St. Francis wanted us to be peacemakers. Help us to recognize the evil latent in our communication that does not build communion. We have to take responsibility for our communication. And if we are not building communion, then we are falling into evil ways. We're listening to the father of lies. We're not listening to God. If we're not bringing people closer together, causing opposition, dividing, all of those things, we are not following the communication as God intended in our creation. May our words be seeds of goodness for the world. I say words, I send them out there. They're going to plant themselves somewhere, maybe in some people. And what's going to grow? I have to take responsibility for that. You have to take responsibility for your words. And right now, if we were to go and assess by the fruits or the lack thereof that are being produced right now, then we'd have to say that there's been a lot of seeds, not of goodness, planted in the world right now. A lot of words were planted that have sprung up as weeds instead of fruit-bearing trees. Okay, thank you so much. And I got done faster than I thought, so thank you for hanging in there, and I'll talk to you later.